Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation, and a Chag Sameach to you all. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and wherever you might be around the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our returning guest, Tony Zendle. I'll introduce Tony in just a moment. A little housekeeping first. You are encouraged to ask questions. Please do this by typing whatever you would like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. You'll also find a chat facility on your screen, and if you want to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, that is the way to do it. Finally, we are recording this event, and you will find it in the next day or so on our website at milim.org.uk. There you will find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Tony Zendle was born in Manchester, and I'm quoting from his biography on Amazon here. He began his literary career when he came second in the London North region of the Department of Health and Social Security Poetry Competition in 1980. While working as an instructional designer, putting complex thoughts into simple language, he began building up an arsenal of trivia, especially Jewish trivia. His publications include the definitive book of Jewish miscellany and trivia, Jews and the Sea, A Forgotten History, and Mastering the Rules of Golf. Regular viewers will recall that Tony has previously been our guest speaking about his earlier book, Kosher Foxtrot, Jewish Band Leaders of the Golden Age of British Dance Bands, and he's also spoken more recently about the Hamburg America line. This evening, he's back for a third visit to speak about this topic, which his latest book is about, Counting the Stars, the Jewish Journey to the Cosmos. Tony, it really is a pleasure to welcome you back. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, and we are excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay, now for the scariest bit, which is to share my screen, my PowerPoint presentation with all of you. And here we go. And everything should be tickety-boo from here in it. And if it isn't, no doubt Jonathan or Alan will bring me to a screaming halt. First of all, is everything okay, Jonathan?
It's perfect.
Good. Okay, well, first of all, may I say peace and long life to all of you. When I was in my teens, I kept a scrapbook of Soviet lunar landings. I went meteor watching on the bridge over Crumpsall Station on dark nights. I've seen the moons of Jupiter through a telescope, stayed up all night to watch Neil Armstrong land on the moon, watched the soft landing of Perseverance on Mars in 2021 and the controlled crash landing on the asteroid in 2022. And it almost goes without saying that I'm a big fan of science fiction, both in the written word and on the screen. And yes, I'm a nerd. So during the pandemic, I noticed that there had been a Jews in Space exhibition in the United States in 2019. And I thought, why have we never done anything like that over here? So I did a little research, and with Leonard coming up, I wrote a talk, as you do. And because I couldn't stuff everything into one little talk, I managed to write a book. I wrote the book. So here you are. Here's the book, The Jewish Journey to the Cosmos, Counting the Stars. As you know from the Bible, Jews and the stars are integral. It splits into two. Real Jews in Real Space is about real Jews who had real lives, who either furthered our understanding of the space or were behind space programs or went into space themselves. And then there are unreal Jews in unreal space, space opera, space theatre, science fiction, imagined world, imagined histories. Let's crack on with real Jews and real space and Jewish astronomy especially. Well, it all starts with the beginning. And here in the beginning, in the fifth verse of Genesis, we get day and we get night. So already we're into astronomy. And where there is day and night, discussions have to be had about when nightfall actually occurs, especially when such as Shabbos come in and out. Halacha states that Shabbos goes out when you can see 3 stars in the sky. And then there are arguments about it. Some say the stars have to be large. Some say the stars have to be medium. Some say it's 40 minutes after sunset. Some say it's 72 minutes after sunset, and so on and so forth. What was needed was tables of dates of times of sunset for anywhere in the known world. And as Judaism follows the lunar calendar, a further set of tables and times to tell Jews when the Sabbath and festivals came in on the secular calendar. And as you can see, here's one for the recent Yom Kippur times of when it went in and out. Through the ages, there were Jewish astronomers documented from about the 10th century, a small army of rabbinical astronomers to make some sense of it. But of course, there weren't only Jewish astronomers, there were also Chinese, Greek, Persian, Roman, and so on and so forth, all working on their own calendars. In the early days, these people were, for the most part, just learned people who spend their days in study. A study of the heavens was just part of their philosophy. Well, it's not surprising when they looked at the movement of the moon and the planets that their studies should end up in the secular world. It should lead to the measurement of the world and therefore a better understanding of things such as navigation for sailors, and as well as improving mankind's understanding of the universe. Now, as for Jewish astronomers, I've focused on 2. Levi Ben Gerson lived in the 13th century in France, and Abraham Zacuto was Spanish, and he's from the 15th century. Gerson's main claim to fame was that he invented an instrument which would later be developed into the sextant, but also his studies expanded the universe to an amazing 100 light years, something that would only be acceptable 200 years later on. Now think about this. We talk about thinking about outside the box, but imagine, if you like, in the 13th century, someone like Gerson, who had a trip from Avignon to Perpignan. It was a major undertaking, but he could visualize not only in miles, but in light years. An amazing person. Abraham Zacuto, in the 15th century, accurately charted the positions of the sun, the moon, the known planets for mariners, and he was instrumental in the discovery and the measurement of latitude. Without the understanding of where they were, north or south, mariners such as Columbus, Vasco da Gama could actually not have sailed. Later on, of course, we have people like these 3. There's William Herschel, who discovered Uranus. Vera Rubin, who made us understand better about a thing called dark matter, which is the glue, by the way, that holds the universe together. And David Levy, who, with a man called Eugene Shoemaker, predicted the collision of a comet with Jupiter. The first time an event of such magnitude had ever been observed. However, I want to focus on one person, which is Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was an amazing person. Here's just some of his achievements. Give you a couple of seconds to read that. So this person thought ahead. What we now call climate change, he was there with greenhouse effect way before. One more person, not an astronomer, but he is someone who revolutionized our understanding of time and space. Einstein explained what would happen when we went on our trips to the stars. He predicted black holes. He was the father of quantum physics. And if you like some, maybe not so light reading, but it moves on nicely, I suggest that you read this quite excellent book. All very well, you might say, but what about going out into space? What about rocket science? Where are the Jewish rocket scientists? Modern rocketry begins in about 1926 with Robert Goddard's first liquid fueled rocket. As far as Jewish involvement in it, though, there wasn't much. The leaders in rocket science at the time were the Germans, and no Jews were going to be invited to Peenemünde to help out, except maybe later on as slave laborers. But the development of the V2 rocket by the Germans during the war, the use of it as a war weapon, showed both the USA and the USSR that post-war they needed to be first in rocket technology. Furthermore, in 1945, the V2 rocket had actually made it into space. And so what came to be known as the space race began in earnest, with the Russians and the Americans trying to grab whatever German rocket scientists from post-war Germany they could. And here's a Jewish rocket scientist, which is Boris Chertok. The USSR had him. Chertok was closely involved with the first satellite into space, Sputnik, and on the first human space flight by Yuri Gagarin in 1961. On the American side, there was Abraham Silverstein, who was an expert in propellants and a few other things. Silverstein was the person who named the Mercury and Apollo space programs. He fundamentally, though, chose the fuel that would be used to get man on the moon. He worked very closely with one of the German scientists who is also in the picture. The person in the picture was a man called Werner von Braun, and he wasn't very Jewish at all. Von Braun and his many fellow scientists had come to the States from Peenemünde as a result of the American Operation Paperclip, which grabbed German scientists from post-war Germany. Chertok actually led the Russians, but failed in his mission. And the main prize he missed was the man who was the driving force behind the V2 rocket, Werner von Braun. Von Braun and his compatriots obviously preferred a life in the USA, and frankly, why wouldn't they? Von Braun and his German scientists, a few Jews, and a few American Gentiles then drove man to walk on the moon. but there is one little twist, and amazingly, it is British. The design of spacesuits was an important part of the project. NASA, in particular, needed the expertise of people who'd been involved in the design of pressure suits. When they looked around the world, there was a company in Newton Heath, Manchester, who were experts in designing suits for pilots flying at high altitudes. The name of the country, believe it or not, was Frankenstein and Sons, although they probably pronounce it Frankenstein. And so when Neil Armstrong went to the moon, we can safely say that part of the suit had been designed by someone who worked for Frankenstein, even if he wasn't a count who lived in the castle. But I've got to tell you at this point, I'm clutching at straws. Jews were really only marginally involved in the space race. And this is true of Jews going into space. The Russians were first with Boris Volyov in Soyuz 5, 1969. American side, we're talking about white Protestant males, test pilots, Navy pilots, and the like, that sort of person. Where the involvement was before the landing on the moon, well, on March 23rd, 1965, the first kosher salt beef sandwich orbited the Earth in Gemini 3. It was brought onto the spacecraft by Alan Young. One of the jobs in the early Gemini missions was to try different foods and different ways of eating them. On the Gemini 3 mission were Virgil Grissom, who sadly died in Apollo 1, and John Young. John Young was quite a character. He was, incidentally, the first person to use the F word on the moon. And you can read all about that in my blog if you wish to. He went to Wolfie's Delicatessen, smuggled it on board, and here's a transcript of what actually was said. And in the spacecraft, it came apart into little particles, and it was actually no good. And they were in hot water when they got back. And here's a quote from NASA, who weren't very pleased about the whole business at all. It didn't phase Young. Young later walked on the moon in Apollo 16, and he was in the space shuttle program, so it didn't seem to bother him all that much. Things have changed. There are now about 20 or so astronauts and cosmonauts. That's at least part Jewish. They are DNA Jewish. And by the way, during my talk, when I talk about Jewish, I mean DNA Jewish, not necessarily halachically Jewish. I'm only going to go through a few. I don't really have time for everyone, but the sad story, the tragedy of Judy Resnick and the Challenger space shuttle disaster, Gregory Shamitov and the bagels that he brought from his aunt's bagel shop, and what great publicity that was. There's Jessica Meir, who is possibly going to be one of the first women to walk on the moon. She's got an Israeli father of Iraqi origin. Now, there's plenty of Jews who work for NASA, and that is exactly how it should be. And of course, private companies are now getting to the act. William Shatner in 2021 became the oldest person to fly in space at age 90. And following this, we have American entrepreneur and billionaire Jared Isaacman popping his head and body out of the space capsule to test the viability of a newly designed spacesuit when he went on the Polaris Dawn mission in 2024. At this point, coming towards the end of this section, I can't talk about it without talking about halacha. There's a joke about the first rabbi in space, which is that we went around the earth every 90 minutes. So every 90 minutes it was Shachris, Mincha, Mavriv, Shachris, Mincha, Mariv, no time for anyone else. Rabbi David Galinkin took it seriously when asked by a Jewish astronaut and said in a response that the date should begin at a single point on Earth. So when you're orbiting the Earth, the home base is Houston Mission Control, and you pray according to the time in Mission Control. So you've got this 24-hour clock. So there you are. That is the real Jews in real space. But we now need to move to the unreal Jews. 1926, Hugo Gernbach publishes the first science fiction magazine called Amazing Stories, coins the term science fiction, uses people like H.G. Wells, Jules Verne. Soon there's a plethora of writers writing for him, people like Isaac Asimov, who we'll see later. And from there, things flew with Imagined World and Imagined Histories. Perhaps the best known imagined history is the one by Michael Chabon, the Yiddish Policemen's Union, where Chabon has Jews going to Alaska in 1941 to avoid the Holocaust. My very favorite alternate history, I think because it really could have happened, was the story called The Eighth Grade History Class Visits the Hebrew Home for the Aging. And this is where they visit and they meet someone called Anna Berkovich, whose name was Anne Frank. Well, in this alternate history, she survived. She wasn't betrayed. She married an American airman. She threw away her dowry and ended her days in a care home in the USA. There were a whole bunch of Jewish sci-fi writers. Here's a small selection of them. Yes, I do know that there are more and that there are others, but have to fit them on a PowerPoint presentation. Robert Silverberg's Rome Eterna is probably the best known of the alternate imagined histories. It imagines a time when Moses never makes it across the Red Sea. Muhammad is assassinated by the Romans. As a result, there is no Christianity, no Islam. And what about the Jews? Well, they remain as a small sect in Egypt, but they finally build spaceships to find the promised land. And the promised land is obviously not on Earth. Sadly, many of the stories that involve Jews are an extension of the expulsion of 1492, but this time not just from Spain, but being expelled from Earth itself, with Israeli Jewish writers, the destruction of Israel itself. A number of the stories are parables for some of the issues that Jews face or have faced. In the Dybbuk of Mazel Tov 4, Silverberg looks at the continuing conflict between from and non-from, where Jews flee from Earth to outer space. They set up a settlement on Mazel Tov 4, where guess what? They've separated into two groups, the secular and the Hasidim. Fun happens when an indigenous alien gets plagued by an evil spirit called Dybbuk, and the fun is, where do the aliens go to, the Hasids or the secular Jews? And I'll let you read it to see where you think they go. Carol Carr writes one called You Think You've Got Troubles, and she talks about intermarriage, which is again an American, a very important thing in America. It's about a nice Jewish daughter who marries a Martian. And it ends with a downbeat. I go back in the living room and extend my hand to my son-in-law the cauliflower. Um, so we have these various writers. I could spend hours on just them. Of the writers, though, the one that stands out the most is Asimov, the one of the big three, together with Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein. He postulated the law of robotics, self-aware robots. We've got AI coming on Storm. He coined the terms robotics and positronic. Asimov was an atheist, but he did occasionally let his slip show. No better than in one book, The Robots of Dawn, where Elijah Bailey, the protagonist, having been saved from certain death, is given a choice of food to revive him. Well, what does he choose but chicken soup? And he enjoys it, although, and I quote, "it isn't as good as the soup my mother made." And you don't get much more Jewish than that. Whether TV or film, though, the USA has produced and continues to produce most of the space theatre. There are the Jewish filmmakers such as Steven Spielberg, J.J. Abrams, and here's a small sample of some of the others. One or two surprises maybe there. And on the British side, there are one or two, notably maybe David Warner, but not as many. Indeed, on the British side, the standout is the recently departed David Graham, who was the first voice of the Daleks. Actually, I'm going to take a minute out of the talk about what this remarkable character actually did. He was the voice behind many of these sort of iconic characters. And yes, Parker, but also Brains, people in Stingray, Fireball XL5, Peppa Pig, so on and so forth. But one of the most famous things he did, which actually doesn't appear in many obituaries, is this.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
But for some of you, that's the first time you've seen it since 1984. Shown to tens of millions at Super Bowl 18, his appearance as Big Brother in the iconic Apple advert heralded the end of the total monopoly that IBM had held in personal computing. Probably one of the most iconic adverts ever, and changed the face of personal computing. However, of all the TV shows and movies, the most Jewish could said to be Star Trek. There's a rich vein of Jewish blood that runs through it. Jewish actors such as Shatner, Nimoy, Carol Kane, Jason Isaacs have all been involved. Damon Shimmerman as Ferengi. And at the production level, we have people like Michael Chabon, Rick Berman, and so on and so forth. In terms of Star Trek and religion, the man who created Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, was an atheist and he wanted nothing to do with religion. So you don't see outwardly Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, or Muslim major characters. Starship pilot Tom Paris does not cross himself before going into action. But religion did creep in to Star Trek. Religion allows Star Trek allows non-humans such as Bajorans, Ferengi, Vulcans to have their own fully formed religions and spirituality. As far as mainstream Earth religions, it's not for us. It's only there in the background. As far as Judaism is concerned, it has been argued. Oh, sorry, it's there in the background. So here we have Jean-Luc with a Christmas tree, someone who's a Hindu, and someone who's a hijab wearing member of the USS Cerritos. It's been argued, though, that through Spock runs the theme of assimilation and integration, a very Jewish theme. I'm not going to get into this mind-blowing arguments about Jewish or not Jewish, but Spock is portrayed as neither fully human nor fully Vulcan, and it does run aside the theme whether Jews are American or Jewish or both, and there are other characters in Star Trek who are in a similar fix, not in the Jewish sense, but they are people who are alien, if you like, to the land they find themselves into, trying to find their identity while wanting to belong to the host society. Of course, when Spock refuses to join the Vulcan Academy, his father refuses to speak to him for 18 years. And if that isn't an example of Bragus, I really don't know what is. Star Trek exists in a universe where discrimination and racism between humans does not exist. So what we see is a displacement activity. This time, it's prejudice of humans against non-humans or non-human societies that exhibit racism. There is the invention of a group called Terra Prime, which is obviously a play on America First. There's racism towards the Illyrians in the new series Star Trek Strange New World. And in Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, they have a man with a black face on the left and white on the right who is prejudiced against someone who is vice versa, as it were. The one Star Trek episode, and you're going to love this, that gets closer to an allegory for anti-Semitism is Patterns of Force. In the episode, the Enterprise tracks down a Federation observer on a planet dominated by a sort of Nazi-esque race called the Ecosians, and the Ecosians are trying to hunt down a race called the Zeons to extinction. Well, when I tell you that not only is the race called Zeons, or like Zions, but that three of the main underground Zeons, are called Isaac, Abraham, and Davod, you get the idea. This has been criticized as a token Holocaust episode, giving Jews their own episode. Although frighteningly, in the modern era, there seem to be a number of people on university campuses who seem to be also bent on hunting Zions. They don't call them Zeons these days. Actually, as I watched, as I researched, I realized that Nazi imagery is a popular theme in science fiction. In the movies, we just have to look at Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. In Star Wars, the First Order and their Nurembergish rally, the ghettoization of humans in Planet of the Apes, and the image of camps in fifth wave to see the popularity of this strain of storytelling, and I haven't yet come to the Daleks. Shall come later. Returning to Jews in space. Of course, the best known Jewish story from Star Trek is of the Vulcan salute created by Leonard Nimoy, who played the science officer Spock. The producers wanted a way that Vulcans made the greeting, and Leonard Nimoy, who incidentally began his career in the Yiddish theatre, based the salute on something he saw in shul, which he'd learnt about as a child. Well, here is Sarek, Spock's father, played by the way, by the Jewish Mark Leonard, saying goodbye to Jean-Luc Picard. And notice the proper form of the greeting, peace and long life. Very Jewish.
Peace and long life. Live long and prosper.
Now there you are. Make a point. Peace and long life. Think about it. Live long and prosper. Peace and long life, followed by live long and prosper. It's Shalom Aleichem, and followed by Aleichem Shalom. And I say no more. I rest my case. British Space Theatre, of course, stands up to anything that the Americans do. We have Arthur C. Clarke. We have H.G. Wells. We have Blake Seven, we have Doctor Who. And of course, it is the standout British science fiction series. And by the way, Tom Baker, no, sadly, is not Jewish. But what we do have is Sidney Newman and Verity Lambert. The Jewish pair of these two were behind the very creation of Doctor Who. If you actually dig deep enough, you'll find British Jews who've written episodes of Doctor Who, such as Neil Gaiman, Louis Marks. There are Jewish actors who've played parts in Doctor Who. The most notable, I think, is Susan Foreman, the first Doctor's granddaughter. So, where did it come from? Terry Nation. The Doctor and their travelling companions have met and fought, a handful of villains and allegorical Nazis. The most obvious allegorical Nazi is, of course, the Dalek, created by Terry Nation, who'd grown up in World War II, based the Daleks on the stereotypical Nazi based on genocide, as we see this still from one of the early Doctor Who's. There's the good old Nazi salute. In the episode called The Dead Planet, a race called the Carleds are eager to exterminate a race on their planet Skaro called the Thals. Clearly, it's an allegory for the Holocaust. As for religion, as for Doctor Who and religion, well, how times have changed, because here's a direct quote. In the early days, Doctor Who was very Christian. It had monks, it had crusaders, it had Huguenots. In the spirit of diversity, the second iteration had Yaz, the Doctor's companion, a practicing Muslim going to the Punjab at the time of the partition of India. However, Doctor Who has now become more post-religion than Star Trek. Russell T. Davies, the writer, has said the show is taking a sly step towards fantasy, which will annoy people to whom it's a hard science fiction show. A storyline that involved one of the major current religions, such as Judaism, would now be seen to be too restrictive. So it goes without saying that as far as having an identifiably Jewish character, that ship has sailed. Identifiably Jewish character. That brings us on to stereotyping. Instead of having Jewish characters, certain aliens seem to have characteristics that are or could be said to be Jewish. Star Trek's writers have been criticized for their portrayal of the greedy, money-oriented Ferengi, but I think complaints about them, frankly, as a Trekkie, I think are overreaction by people who don't actually watch or don't actually understand Star Trek. Star Wars is slightly different. It's been not only criticized for being anti-Semitic, but not only that, anti-Japanese, anti-Arab, anti-Rastafarian. But within Judaism, there's a character called Watto. Now, with a schnozzle like that, Watto is the most criticized character. But as he pointed out in the Jerusalem Post, the actor actually said he was trying to do an Italian accent, not a Middle European accent. My opinion for what it is worth is that there was a lack of care. Some of the stereotypes that you see were in plain sight. Anyone with a brain could have seen them. I doubt if they'll make that error again. And you can see the text here. His bright-eyed kid, then with the Jedi, he becomes a psychopath. So finally, where are there Jewish characters in space theatre? Well, there aren't many, but I have to make the point there's not many identified Buddhists, Muslims, or Christians. But here are a few, and you may note the Levinsons in Independence Day, where Judaism plays quite a major part. In fact, the only identifiable thing in Doctor Who, a Jewish character in Doctor Who, was the highly stereotypical Julius Silverstein, a greedy, grasping businessman with a Middle European accent. You might recognize the stereotype. If they hadn't meant him to be Jewish, then why give him the name Silverstein? Well, here is poor old Julius dying at the hands of a Yeti.
But I warned you, Julius, I warned you!
Get out! Take him away! Nobody destroys Julius Silverstein's collection! Nobody!
Come on,
No!
Father,
The Yeti is mine! You can't scare me with your wild stories! Get out! 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 Travis, it is you? I am not frightened by your stupid tricks. Travis, I know it's you. I'm not a fool.
They just don't make monsters like that anymore, do they? Poor old Julius. In one episode of Babylon 5, we have a rabbi conducting a shiva for the bacon eating, but nonetheless Jewish commander Susan Ivanova, and you'll probably recognize Theodore Beichel, who was a master of Fiddler in the Roof, played a lot of Jewish roles. Standing out from the pack of Jewish characters are two, and one is actually British. This is Quatermass. Quatermass is interesting. It was a highly successful but short-lived series and probably reached its peak with Quatermass in the Pit There were no Jewish themes in it, but it was directed by Rudolf Cartier, who had escaped from Nazi Germany pre-war, and produced by the Jewish Verity Lambert and written by Nigel Neal, whose wife was the Jewish writer Judith Kerr. It is not therefore surprising on the fourth series there's a specifically Jewish character who was Dr. Quatermass's sidekick, and also the lighting of a menorah, maybe not in the right way, in an episode. Finally, and probably the best, is Futurama, and this is an animated science fiction soap opera full of Jewish American humor. One of its protagonists is Dr. Zoidberg, a lobster-type creature who speaks with a New York Jewish accent. It has a character called the Hanukkah Zombie, a golem-like creature, voiced interestingly by Mark Hamill, aka Luke Skywalker, who goes around in the specially adapted Star Wars fighter. And this.
Ooh, a bat mitzvah. Shalom hunger, shalom free food.
No shellfish.
That is so unfair.
So, what's the deal? You guys don't believe in robot Jesus?
We believe he was built and that he was a very well-programmed robot, but he wasn't our Messiah.
So there you are. Actually, they got the Hebrew slightly wrong, and here's a revision of it, but that's, again, a nerdy sort of thing. And you can see that the writer, of course, is Jewish. So if you have more Jewish characters that you know about, I'm not interested about actors. I'm about if you have Jewish characters, then please do email me and tell me all about them. So summing up, and here's some of the links if you should need them. Jewish involvement in the human exploration of real space continues. Jews should be proud of that. In real space, the contribution continues to be made. It's made in an occasional way, nonetheless a real way. As far as unreal space is concerned, for the most part, any discussion of religion in general or Judaism in particular is limited to the written word, with writers today like Lavi Tidhar and Mary Cowell. Just as Fawlty Towers and the Sweeney could not be written today, to have a character who had a religious belief system in either film or TV is just not possible. And to finish with, I think we really need a bit of Mel Brooks, do we not?
See, Jews in space!
We're Jews out in space. We're zooming along, protecting the Hebrew race. We're Jews out in space. If trouble appears, we'll put it right back in its place. When Goyim attack us, we'll give them a smack, we'll slap them right back in the face.
And so therefore, and all I have to say finally is live long and prosper. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tony. That really was an excellent presentation. We have a few minutes left. If any of our audience have a question for you, please do write it in the Q&A in the next few minutes. Do you think Jews are represented at the right level in this in this area, or do you think Jews are disproportionately involved in matters associated with space?
Funnily enough, might argue that there's a disproportionate number of Jews that have been astronauts. When you think about it, not only Shamitov and people like that, but there've been two Israelis. Sadly, one who died in a disaster. But so certainly the number of Jewish science fiction writers, there's a massive number. Israeli science fiction, by the way, has burgeoned. It's really a big thing. So I think it's gone from very little representation to a sort of a reasonable representation now. I think it's not British though. I'm thinking America, but British there aren't many Jews. The man who created the Dalek song, by the way, is Jewish. Murray Gold. He created the Dalek theme tune. So yes, not necessarily in Britain, but certainly in America, there's quite a few.
We have an anonymous question. Have you read any of Leeds's own sci-fi writer, Charles Stross? Now, Charles and I were actually at school together, so that's a very interesting question.
I say no, I'm afraid not, because there are so many. There are so many books in the world that one has to read through them. So no, the recent ones that I've been reading are the recent writers are people like Titar, Cowell, and there's another one whose name escapes me. So they're the recent writers. But what name is? No,
Charles Stross.
Charles Stross.
Yeah, he doesn't live in Leeds anymore, but he certainly grew up here. And I think he's quite well known, has quite a cult following.
Yes, I'll look him up post talk. There are hundreds though.
And interesting in the imagined histories that you mentioned that Anne Frank makes an appearance. I think the fictionalization of Anne Frank might actually be quite a good talk for you, because she is in so many novels. I know Philip Roth drew on her a lot, and what was the book where she's in the attic? Is it one of Nathan Englander's? Somebody buys a house and Anne Frank's up in the attic.
That's right. There are imagined histories that I had to leave out other Anne Frank stories. There's another story where Anne Frank, again, it's the concept is that Anne Frank actually survives. And there's another story about Anne Frank surviving and going and doing different things with her life. And the wonder is, what would Anne Frank have done if she in this thing, because she's a writer, yeah. Again, she throws away the diary, but she's a writer. And so she becomes a famous Yiddish writer, because the Jews in this one don't all get murdered in Eastern Europe. So there's a thriving Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe. Yeah. And she's important. So, yes.
Fascinating. Well, we haven't got any more audience questions. So you can buy this book on Amazon. It's not a long book, but it's full of absolutely packed with very, very interesting information. And to say thank you to you, Tony, I'm going to send you some more of my photos.
Oh, lovely.
Pictures of Israelis. So hopefully you'll enjoy flicking through those. Now, just a brief word about our upcoming program before we leave you. Next week, we've got the author Jono Ellison with us. He's written two books, one about a world record-breaking taxi ride, including some interesting times in the Middle East, and one with a more local theme for Leodensians. He's walking the length of the River Wharfe. So we'll be chatting about both of his books. We've got a lot more in the pipeline. Please check at milim.org.uk for details. You can sign up to our newsletter there, and that way you'll be sure not to miss anything. All these online events are free, but you can, if you wish, make a small donation. There is a link in the chat and also on our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Tony Zendle, once again. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all again as a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.